Good morning, everyone. This is Reed Sandlins from Accord & Company. We're a minute over the start of the hour here, so I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and assemble to then learn more about TimberScan. So Accord & Company is the largest TimberScan reseller in the country, and we've got this very long-term, where we have had this very long-term relationship with the folks at Core Associates, now Avid Exchange. We've got lots of really happy customers on their products, and we'd love to turn it over now to Mike Carbonneau at Core Associates to tell you more about TimberScan specifically for 300 CRE today.
All right, thank you very much, Reed. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take the screen at this point. I'll open up my PowerPoint and we'll go ahead and get started. So let's kick things off here. Everyone should be able to see my screen. Let's just get this going. There we go. Okay, so yes, again, thank you very much, Reed, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to spend the next hour talking with you about TimberScan. I'm going to start with a brief PowerPoint presentation. It won't take us very long to get through PowerPoint, and then we're going right into the product. So anticipate most of this hour is going to be spent with me doing a product demonstration for you and kind of walking through TimberScan really from soup to nuts. So with that, let's go to what I want to refer to as purchase to pay. And we're going to talk about purchase to pay several times today. You're going to hear me say this more than once. So what do we mean by purchase to pay? What we mean is managing every aspect of an accounts payable invoice. From the point that invoice arrives at your door, we're talking about being able to acquire that invoice. We're talking about being able to do the invoice entry in TimberScan, which mirrors the Sage 300 AP entry functionality. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further into this. The ability to create flexible workflows so that you can seamlessly route the invoices for review and approval. And then once those invoices have been approved and they've updated Sage 300, the automated payment process. Now, one of the things that you're not seeing here, but I just want to emphasize, is that all of the things that I just listed, each one of these bullet items, are things that you can do without having to touch a piece of paper. You can manage every aspect of an invoice from purchase to pay without ever having to handle a piece of paper. You don't have to receive the invoice in the mail. There are ways that you can eliminate that if you work with your vendors and subs. You don't have to go through an acquire process, meaning you don't have to take an invoice and put it on a scanner. You can just acquire it by email. Invoice entry is all done electronically. Routing and approval can be done all electronically. And finally, payment of an invoice can be done electronically where you're not having to print out checks and put checks in the mail. That's what I'm going to show you today. We're going to walk through that entire process, and I'll show you how easy it is to be able to do this, to be able to create those efficiencies where it not only will save your company time, but it will save your company money. Okay, just a little bit of detail about TimberScan itself. TimberScan was created in 2008, so the product has been around for quite a long time. It is the only complete purchase to pay solution in the construction industry. There are other products that have tried to replicate it, but TimberScan is the only product that goes the entire workflow process from initial purchase through pay, and you can handle everything within the application. We have over 2,000 clients. As Reed mentioned, Accord & Company has been TimberScan's most valued partner over the years. There are more TimberScan clients that are Accord clients than we have throughout the rest of the country. So it's a wonderful relationship. Anytime you wanted to visit with some of the your fellow companies out there, I'm sure that the Accord Company can provide you with a number of references on clients that are happily using TimberScan today. We have over 35,000 users worldwide. So it's a widely distributed product that's been out there for a long time. And I think you'll see today why it is such a successful application. So just a couple of other workflow items that I wanted to show you here. So we call TimberScan part of what we call the Avid Suite for construction. And that includes everything from that entire purchase to pay process. And it starts with that point where an invoice arrives at your door, but it could actually it could be preceded by a purchase order. That purchase order, TimberScan does have a purchasing application, or you may have created a purchase order in Sage 300, or you may have created a manual purchase order, or maybe you didn't create a purchase order at all. It doesn't make any difference as far as TimberScan is concerned, which of those options you choose. But once the invoice arrives at your door, the invoice is managed through TimberScan, routed for review and approval, sent on to Sage 300 once the approval process is done, and then the payment process takes place on the back end, and it's managed starting through Sage 300, but then pushing that data back to TimberScan. So that's what you're going to see today. The final PowerPoint presentation that I want to show you, this one last slide, is basically a workflow depiction of what you're going to see in a few minutes. And basically, again, where things start are when the invoice arrives at your door. We're going to talk about the different ways that those invoices can get into TimberScan initially through the acquire process. We're going to send those invoices off to accounts payable invoice entry, where they'll be entered. The invoice will then be passed off to the approvers. Approvers are able to approve invoices in any environment that they want. They could be on their mobile phone and they could still approve the invoice if need be. But once that approval process is done, there is a final review step that we built, and it's primarily designed for accounting to be able to take that one last look at the invoices, make sure that they've been properly coded and what have you, and then they get sent off to Sage 300 automatically. The only thing left in Sage 300 is they have to be posted. So everything that took place along the way allowed for that invoice. Once it updates Sage 300, there's no additional entry that needs to be made. I think you'll see how seamless the integration is with Sage 300. And then on the back end, what we're going to talk about is how you're going to start the payment process, doing your check selection and your print checks option in Sage 300, but then managing that back through TimberScan. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to jump out of the PowerPoint, and we're going to go right into the product now. We're going to start to work our way through TimberScan. And I'm going to show you TimberScan in two different formats today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the traditional TimberScan application that many of our clients use today. And to do that, what I did is I logged in, I used this icon on my desktop, and it took me through my security credentials to a screen that looks like this. So the TimberScan master menu has these applications across the top. And as you select any of these, what it does is it brings up the various applications, or in this case, I went into the reports menu. These are the different reports that I have available to me, and I can select any of these, and it will open up that report into the lower body of the window, and we can work forward from there. So it's a very easy, very user-friendly application to be able to work with. You're just selecting whatever application you want to go to, and then you select the function that you want to choose from there. Now, I also opened up TimberScan with my dashboard, and you're going to see different places that I'll go today where you're going to see different dashboards available to the various users that are in the system. So in this case, what I did is I set up my dashboards to be able to see things like the outstanding invoices by vendor, by job, by days to discount. So if I'm in accounting and I want to be able to see this information, I can quickly go look right here on the dashboard. And if I start to hover the mouse around the pie chart, you notice how it starts to tell me the number of outstanding invoices I have for that vendor and the number and the dollar amount. Same thing with job, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned that there are a lot of different dashboards with which someone could choose to be able to use. There's an entire library that you can select from over here on the right-hand side. I chose these, but you could add more panels, less. It's really, each individual user's choice to some extent. But then again, let me just also mention that from a security perspective, you can also restrict what you don't want people to be able to see through these dashboards. So if I don't, if I'm not, if I don't have access to someone else's jobs, I'm not going to be able to call up their jobs in a dashboard here. Okay, so the dashboard gives you that 20,000 foot view, eliminates you having to run a bunch of reports and what have you. But let's now start to dig into that workflow process. And we're going to start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door. Now, to retrieve that invoice and get it into TimberScan, we're going to choose the acquire function, and then we're going to choose the option acquire images, and it opens up this viewer. Now, there are several ways in which you can acquire an invoice into the system. Obviously, if you receive invoices in the mail, you would put them onto your scanning device and you can scan them, and then they will scan and drop into the viewer here, which I'm going to show you some examples in a couple of minutes. What I think is a much better, more efficient way is to use TimberScan's email monitoring program. What the email monitoring program does is it's actually watching a designated AP email address. So as vendors and subs are emailing invoices to you, it watches that address and it says, okay, every time we get an attachment, let's take it from that particular email and we'll drop it into a file and we'll open it up from the file. And I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. You can also drag and drop documents. So if I had something that was in a file, in a folder, where I just wanted to be able to take something and just, from my desktop, like this 2-page invoice, I can just go ahead and drag and drop, pull it up here in the screen. I have the zoom in and zoom out tools. You can also just use the wheel of your mouse like I'm doing now, and I can just make this document larger or smaller on the screen. So I pulled in a 2-page invoice. Page 1 shows me this is invoice 393. Over in the thumbnail view, if I go to the second page, I have a second invoice. Now, normally what will happen is TimberScan will treat each PDF as an invoice, or just let's say a single invoice. But in this case, because SCS sent us 2 invoices in one PDF, I need to split these. So to do that, you can either click on this button at the top called Mark as New Invoice, or if I had a series of pages here, I can just take any page that I need to, and I can just right click, I can insert a break, and now I've just separated these. So now this is invoice 1 and this is invoice 2. So drag and drop is an option, as I mentioned. We also talked about scanning, and then there's the email monitoring. So with scanning and email, what will happen in either case, you're going to either scan to a file, or with the email monitoring, it's going to take the attachment from the email and it's going to put it in a file for you. So all I would have to do in the acquire screen is I simply come in here, I open up that particular file, and I can go find the invoices that have been, let's say, emailed, and I'll just take this whole group of them all at one time, and I just pulled up a whole series of invoices that I can then look at. I can see, the Payne Electric invoice, and I can just scroll up and down through the various pages if I need to make any changes. But ultimately what I'm going to do after I've initially acquired them here into the viewer is I'm then going to assign them to someone or a group of people in accounts payable invoice entry. That's where this data entry group area comes into play. So let's say that I want to take these invoices and I want to send them off to my accounts payable group or accounts payable person to have them go through and start entering the invoices in TimberScan. You can have multiple people here, multiple groups. I just took someone called DE for data entry, if you will, and I've said, okay, these are the invoices I'm going to assign to data entry. I hit process. The invoices come out of the viewer. They get sent off and assigned to this particular person or group, and then they're going to pick them up and they'll start entering the invoices in TimberScan, which is where I'm going to go next. So this is step 1 of that process of acquiring it, and you can see that I'm already at the point where I'm not touching a piece of paper anymore. Even if that invoice came in by mail, I put it onto a scanning device, I scanned it to a file, and once it's sitting in the file, it becomes electronic, and I never touch a piece of paper after this, at this point from this point forward. So everything that's happening inside TimberScan does not require that you need to be able to touch a piece of paper. All right, so from here, we've gone through the acquire. Let's go on to the next step, which is going to be invoice entry. So in invoice entry, I'm going to go in here. I have 56 invoices that are queued up waiting for me to process. I'll just go ahead and for right now, just randomly call up the very first invoice in this batch. And it's this invoice for power equipment rental. So just to explain the invoice entry screen for a moment, I have the invoice image in the upper part of the window, which again, I can just open up and make larger or smaller if I need to. I have the data entry grid down here in the lower part of the window. And then I have a series of control buttons across the bottom and top. And I'm going to touch on several of these action buttons here as we go. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out is that the AP invoice entry functionality, all of these fields are lined up in the exact same order as they are in Sage 300 CRE. So when we designed TimberScan, we wanted to make it similar to a kind of a layer that sits on top of Sage 300 CRE. Now, this may not look exactly like your data entry screen because maybe you've configured it somewhat differently, but it doesn't matter. However you've configured your AP invoice entry screen, that's exactly what you're going to see here. What does that do? It means that from the perspective of implementing TimberScan, you don't have to learn a new AP entry functionality. I don't have to go to a brand new screen that's completely different and foreign from Sage 300 CRE. These fields are all going to work the exact same way as they do in Sage 300. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and select my vendor. I don't know the vendor code for power equipment rental, but just like as if I were in Sage, I can just go to my list here at the bottom of the screen. I'm now searching the vendor file where I can sort by vendor number, vendor name, or address. We included address in our search just because we find it might be easier if you've got a vendor with multiple addresses to be able to search for it by address rather than by vendor name. But I'm just going to, in this case, I'll start typing in some key search letters here, and I find power equipment rental. All of the master files in TimberScan, the vendor, the job, the cost code, the GL account code, the commitment, those are all coming directly from Sage 300. So it's not like I have to build anything in here. Again, think of this as a layer that sits on top of Sage 300. And we're just exchanging information back and forth, just as if we were passing information back and forth between different modules from within Sage. So I choose power equipment rental. Once I do that, if you're using the compliance portion of Sage 300, you'll get these compliance warnings just like you would there. When I plug in the invoice number, if it's a duplicate invoice, which this one is, it's going to stop me and let me know immediately that I have a duplicate invoice. So again, speaking to the integration with Sage 300, it already knows that I have a duplicate invoice somewhere. That invoice doesn't necessarily have to reside in TimberScan. It could be an invoice that we've already processed and posted in Sage. So let's say that I decide I want to pause for just a moment, and I want to take a look and try and figure out when did we process invoice 24011 for power equipment rentals previously. What I can do, I don't have to leave the invoice entry screen. I'm just going to choose this history button down here at the bottom, and I'm going to bring up a list of all of the invoices for power equipment rental. Again, these are not just invoices that are sitting in TimberScan. These are all of my invoices for this particular vendor. It's laid out in a report that looks like an Excel spreadsheet, and you can use it similar to Excel. So if I just click on one of the column headings, I can sort by that column. You can group, you can sort. I can even export this to Excel if I want to. What I'm going to do is I just want to find that duplicate invoice, which is right here. I can see the original invoice date, the accounting date, when it was paid if it was. When I click on the detail button, what it does is it shows me how that invoice was coded, to what jobs, commitments, cost codes, those types of things. Now, this was a single line entry, but on a multi-line entry, I would see all of the line items listed. The other thing that I can do here, I can hover the mouse on the commitment, the job, the cost code, or the category, and it will bring up a tooltip that will provide me with more detail and more information associated with that field. For example, if I hover the mouse on the commitment, I can see the original committed amount, any change orders, what's been paid, what's been invoiced in the balance. On the job, I can see the revised contract amount of the job and the job to date billings. On the cost code, I can see what's been invoiced on that cost code and how it compares against the revised estimate. Same thing with the cost category. These tooltips are available everywhere in TimberScan where you happen to be able to view this information on the screen. So if I'm looking up a job somewhere in TimberScan, it doesn't matter where it is. I can hover the mouse on that particular field and it brings up these tooltips. So again, this speaks to the integration, and it allows you to be able to see things at your fingertips that normally you might have to go out and run several reports in order to be able to gather. But it's all pulled together for you right here. Now, in addition to the detail, what I can also do is I can call up that original invoice image. So I see the invoice here. Someone put a sticky note on it. Behind it, I have all of the supporting documents. So someone also attached a purchase order. And then what I also have is called the approval page. So the approval page is something that TimberScan builds automatically every time an invoice is acquired into the system. And basically, it's an audit log that's tracking every iteration of the invoice. When it was originally received and by whom, who entered it and when, who are the approvers, who was the final reviewer, who posted this and saves 300 CRE. So this tracks everything that took place, when it took place. And what you can also do in individual users' profiles is you can have them save a signature so that when this automatically gets approved by Doug, his signature could be stamped on here as well. So this audit log, this approval page is attached to every single invoice in the system for your reference if need be. All right, so we've dug into some of the details. Now I know, of course, I have that duplicate invoice. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to continue. I'm going to append this invoice, plug in the dollar amount. We'll go down to the distribution grid. Now I'm going to take this from a couple of different perspectives. I'm going to start by entering an invoice with a commitment, and then I'm going to show you a different example of one without a commitment. But before I do that, I also want to mention one other thing, because Sage 300 CRE is not only an application that can be used with construction companies, it is also companies that are real estate managers as well. And if you're primarily a real estate management company, you're probably not putting in commitments, jobs, and cost codes. You're putting in GL prefix and GL base account. And I just wanted to mention as a sidebar that if you're doing that, this is what you would see that distribution down here of that GL prefix, GL base, or property and unit. So rest assured, if you're just doing property management and not doing job costing, the system will work equally well for you. But let's look at this from the perspective of managing against commitments and then also just charging to individual jobs, for example. So I'm going to just go through here. I'm going to go out and I'm going to find the commitments. I'm going to choose this first commitment here at the top. This is a commitment that has just a couple of line items on it. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, okay, I could individually come down through and I could select my line items that I want to invoice against. But what I'll do is I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's just choose both of these. Say, okay. And then I'm just going to finish this up. And what the system will do once we get through these compliance warnings is it just goes ahead and it builds those line items from the commitment, shows me the commitment summary here on the right-hand side. Here's my committed amount. Here's what's been invoiced to date. Here's what's currently sitting in TimberScan. And if the balance goes negative, you notice how it highlights it in red. So it's taking the combination of what's been invoiced and what's currently in TimberScan that hasn't been updated into Sage yet. And it gives me that balance against the commitment. Over here, I have my line items that I selected. Obviously, I can hover the mouse on any of these fields if I need to, make any modifications as required, and then I can simply go through and accept that invoice. And when I do so, it sends the invoice off to the approvers. Now, how does it get to the approvers? It gets to the approvers by the business rules that you set up behind the scenes. So one of the first things that you'll do when you implement TimberScan is you're going to build these workflow rules, and they're meant to reflect how you route invoices today. So if you said, well, what we would normally want to do is just route it to the project manager on this job, we have a way that we can just pull the project manager credentials from Job Cost and Sage, and we can just apply it and we can send it off to the project manager if need be. But you could say, well, we have multiple approvers. That's fine. You set up the multiple approvers in the workflow. You could say, well, we want to have thresholds, invoices greater than a certain dollar amount. We'd like them escalated up to another level of approval. All of those things are set up in the workflow, the business rules. And then all you have to do from this perspective is you simply go through and accept the invoice, the business rules become invoked, and it sends it off to the approvers right from here. Very seamless, very easy, very simple. You always have the opportunity to be able to override a business rule if there was some circumstance that you needed to do that. But typically, most of the invoices are simply going to get accepted and sent off to the approvers, and you're on to the next invoice. So this is an example of processing an invoice against a commitment. Let's go ahead and back out these line items for a moment. And I'll show you a different example of one where maybe I don't have a commitment. But perhaps all I know is that this is supposed to be charged to job 03001. So we'll just go ahead and plug that in. And once I'm done with that, let's say that I decide, I'm, in here in accounts payable, I know that this power equipment rental invoice is supposed to be associated with this job 03001, but I don't know how it's supposed to be cost coded. So what you can do, you have the flexibility in TimberScan of partially coding an invoice, but still accepting it and sending it off to the approvers and let the approvers code on their end. So that is an option that you can choose that creates a lot of flexibility for you, where you don't have to necessarily code everything or put it to a dummy cost code, for example, just to be able to get it routed. You don't have to do that. You can code it to the point and extent that you have available to you, send it off, and let the approvers code. Now, some clients say, you know what, we don't want our approvers actually physically coming in and coding, and that's fine. You can just have them put a note on the invoice to say this is how it should be coded, but you do have this flexibility of letting them code and also partially coding an invoice and Invoice Entry. All right, let's talk about a few other tools that you have available here. One of the things you can do, joint payees, so joint checks are available through here. Supporting documents, something that I haven't talked about yet. So, TimberScan is not just an AP routing and approval system, it's a full document management system. You can store and manage all of your documents through TimberScan, not just AP invoices. So if you're thinking about, well, we have all these other documents that we're either putting in our filing cabinets, purchase orders or receivers and those types of things, or, or we're using the Windows file system. You don't have to do that. You can store them in TimberScan. You can always create indexes to be able to call them up very quickly and very easily, or route them if you need to. Let's say that I wanted to go out and just see what documents have I acquired that I could potentially use as a supporting document to this vendor and job combination. So I click on the supporting documents tab. I have credit card receipts, I have delivery tickets, I have a purchase order. I can just go ahead and look at this particular PO. Okay, this looks like the one I need. I just go ahead and hit the attach button, and it will just take that particular purchase order and it will attach it right to this invoice right from there. We talked about the history. You can email. So a couple of things here. I talked about supporting documents. Not only could you call up a supporting document, but you can just drag and drop a document right to this screen. If it's something that I haven't actually acquired in the system yet, but I have it somewhere available to me, I can just go ahead and attach it right from here. You can also drag and drop an email. So if I were having email correspondence with, let's say, someone who's associated with this particular project, and I want to be able to take that email correspondence and drop it to this particular invoice and attach it, you just drag and drop that whole email conversation right here, and you can attach it right from there. Speaking of email, you can email from TimberScan. So I could come out here and I could say, I want to just go ahead and send this off to my contact at Power Equipment Rental. And I'm just going to go ahead and attach the invoice as a PDF, and I'll just hit send and off it goes. So instead of me having to print this out to a PDF, go out to Outlook, create an Outlook email, attach the PDF to the Outlook email, basically everything's done right within TimberScan for me. Okay, you've got all your annotation tools over here on the right-hand side, including being able to put a signature on if I want to. But if you don't want to clutter up an invoice with a bunch of sticky notes, what you can do instead is you can just click on the comment tab here at the top of the screen, and you can just add a note, save it, and then anytime someone opens up the invoice, the note will pop up in front of the invoice. Makes it very simple, very easy. But these are the basic mechanics of the AP invoice entry functionality within TimberScan, except for one key feature that I haven't touched on yet, and I'm going to now. What you saw me do so far is I came in, I took this Power Equipment Rental invoice, and I basically keyed in all of the information from start to finish. But TimberScan also has an optical character recognition component. It's called TimberScan Capture. And what it does is it allows you to be able to define certain information on the invoice or associated with the invoice that you want to retrieve and pre-populate the invoice entry screen so you can eliminate the keystrokes and not have to key all this information in yourself. Let's back out of here and I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So I'm going to go back for just a moment. I'm going to go into what I call my capture templates. These are vendor invoices that I've acquired and said I wanted to create a template from them. And I'm going to use this example here for HD Supply. So I'm going to call up HD Supply. And what I did was I took their invoice, I acquired it, and I said I want to set up a template. So through the template program, what the system does is it says, okay, let's find certain information on the invoice that we want to retrieve. The invoice numbers, notice how it's highlighted here in blue. So basically what I'm saying is, whenever I get an invoice from HD Supply, it's going to look to this particular field, this box, and whatever's in that box, that's where we're going to populate with the invoice number. Same thing with invoice date, highlighted here in gray. The balance due, which is down here a little bit further, highlighted in green. So it's going to find the total invoice amount. That's going to become the balance due. If you wanted to retrieve a description from something on the invoice, you can do that as a default. If the vendor puts your job number or your commitment number, maybe that's the purchase order number or something that's on the invoice, you can retrieve those particular fields so that hypothetically you could populate not only the header information, not only the vendor invoice number, date, and amount, but you could also pull in the commitment number, for example, or the job number, if it happens to be on the invoice. Now, speaking of vendor number, you'll notice that on this particular screen, there's nothing on here that says, where am I going to get the vendor number? Because the vendor number is not on the actual invoice image. HD Supply isn't putting their vendor code on their invoice. That's something that you've created inside Sage 300 CRE. So beyond being able to just get information from the actual invoice image, what you can also do when you set up a template is you can set up what are called defaults. Certain things that we want to default into the invoice entry screen based on the template that we're using so that we don't have to key it in. And one of those things that we're going to use as a default is the vendor number. Where I'm going to do that is through this option called invoice coding. So in here, I'm just going to come in and I'm going to say, I want to be able to, automatically put in HD Supply's vendor code. I don't have HD Supply in my Sage database, so I just use this as an example. But this is defaulted in for me. I also said whenever I get invoices from HD Supply, for the foreseeable future, they're going to go to this particular project. I know we're getting materials from them. It's not going to be labor or something like that. So these are the various default fields that you can have set up so that it will just populate the invoice entry screen with all of this, along with all of the information that it retrieves from the invoice. Very simple to set these templates up, takes very little time. And once you set up a template, what will then happen is, once we go back and we acquire an invoice for HD supply, instead of me having to key everything in like I did for power equipment rental, what it will do for this one, the HD supply invoice, is notice how it's already pre-populated the vendor number, the invoice number, the date, the amount, the job, cost category, the dollar amount down here. Hypothetically, I could open up this invoice. I look at it quickly and I say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to be cost coding this. I'm going to let the approver do that. I can just go ahead and accept it, and off it goes. And I literally never touch the keyboard at all. So in a matter of seconds, the invoice perhaps got acquired by email monitoring, came into the AP entry screen, and I'm able to take that invoice, drop it in the invoice entry. I see all the coding is already done. I just go ahead and accept it, and off it goes. That's how seamless this process can become. Okay, so let's do this. Let's now go to that next step, which is the approval part. Just before I do that, I did want to mention a couple of things. I've talked about the reports and the dashboard and the inquiry, just to give you a quick snapshot and an example. So, there are a whole series of reports out here that do things like statistics, analytics, those types of things. Here's a very simple report. It shows me here's what the number of outstanding invoices I have and the dollar amount. But these reports also have drill down capability. So if I wanted to drill in a little deeper, now I can see where those 117 invoices are located. And if I want to go one step further, I want to look at Doug and I'm going to say, okay, let me dig into how long has he been sitting on these 7 invoices that he has. Now it shows me when they were assigned, the vendor, the invoice, the date. I've got all the information sitting right in front of me. Now, just to mention, TimberScan also has a notification system. So you can send alerts and notifications to, to people when they get invoices routed to them. And you can also ping them for things like, your invoice is within 3 days of the discount date or 5 days of the due date. Please get it approved, those types of things. In addition to the reports, I wanted to just highlight this one other thing here in the inquiries. So if you're doing, for example, substantiated billings, a time and material or cost plus billing, or for a loan draw, you need to be able to pull up all of the detailed backup to support any of those scenarios. You can simply, through this job cost inquiry, you could come in here. Now I'm going to put in all dates because that's where I'm going to get my demo data. But you could potentially say, okay, give me everything starting from, let's say, February 1st to February 28th. I want to see all of the information for that time period for a particular project so that I can compile all the backup that I need to support this substantiated billing. So I'm going to do everything for that particular job 03001. Now, it builds this spreadsheet. I have lots of detail on this spreadsheet. I call it a spreadsheet. It's basically kind of a static inquiry that's in the system here. But not only does it have all of my accounting information, all my job cost info, but way over here on the right-hand side, I have all the invoice images. If I needed to compile backup to support a substantiated billing, you click on the report button, you say you want to download the images to whatever format that you want, and in a matter of seconds, I just created that substantiated billing report, and I downloaded all of those invoice images to be able to hand off to an auditor or whatever it's needed for. That's how quickly and easily you can do that. All right, we have about 20 minutes left. I want to leave a few minutes for some questions here, so I'm going to kind of go through a few things here fairly quickly. But one other thing I wanted to mention is that what you saw me do so far, take invoices and acquire them into the system from, let's say, typically, a vendor invoice. But TimberScan also has a forms tool that works hand in hand with the TimberScan AP entry. And in particular, where you can highlight that would be through credit card. So let's just talk for a moment about credit card reconciliation. What TimberScan allows you to do is I could take a form, a TimberScan form, and I'm going to show you this here, where I'm, perhaps I went out to Lowe's and I made a purchase at Lowe's. So I could be on my phone. I call up my form on my phone. I fill out this information. This is all set up in, in the format where it will allow me to download information directly from Sage, so I can go ahead and pull up whatever job and cost code it's associated with if need be. I could have taken a picture of that receipt from Home Depot, and I can attach it to the form, and then I just go ahead and submit that form. When I do that, TimberScan has a credit card reconciliation tool. It can download the statement from the credit card company automatically, and then from here, I can come in and I can do my reconciliation. These are my receipts on the right-hand side. This is my statement information on the left-hand side. When I hit reconcile, it will start to try to match each of the receipts to the statement items, as using criteria such as date, amount, balance, card number, those types of things. As it reconciles, what it will do is it will drop everything up here into the, kind of the statement detail area. And ultimately, when I hit this transfer to TimberScan button, what that will do is it will create an invoice or invoices, depending on how you want to format those receipts. Do you want them to go in as what we call statement style, where the statement becomes one invoice and the receipts become supporting documents behind it? Or do you want receipt style, where it takes each individual receipt and creates a separate invoice? But the system allows you to do this, sends this back to TimberScan, and then in TimberScan, in Invoice Entry, I'll show you an example of this. Let's go down here to this one right here. All right, so what it did is it took my credit card statement, I reconciled it. The statement became my invoice. It took all of my receipts, attached them, and then I have all of my coding detail already done here, based on how it was coded, as the receipt was being captured originally and sent through the reconciliation. Now, let's say that, someone says, well, we can't have our people that are out there making these purchases also doing all of that job cost coding. They need to be able to make the purchase very quickly, take a copy of the receipt and submit it. Fine. What you can do here, once that statement gets over here to TimberScan, if the coding hasn't been completed, you can simply go through and accept the invoice, route it off to the approvers, and have them go through and approve it just like they would any other invoice. Okay, so let's do something else here. All right, we're going to go over to the approval side now. And you started to see kind of a little bit of a snapshot. I mentioned at the outset, I was going to show you TimberScan in two different views or two different formats. So what I showed you initially was traditional TimberScan here. What I want to do now is I want to come over here to TimberScan in the cloud. This is called TimberScan Go. And the way TimberScan Go was designed initially, it was designed more from the approver's perspective. Because if you think about it, most of the time accounting is, they're able to come in and they're sitting at their desk or what have you, and they're able to process invoices on their desktop, their laptop, whatever it is. But a lot of times approvers might be out in the field. They may not necessarily be in the office. So we created this as a browser cloud-based application to allow approvers to be able to approve from anywhere. So what I can do here is, as an approver, I can come in, I can call up my invoices. And then as I look at my invoices, if I want to call up this power equipment rental invoice, got some notes here that are popped up in front of it. We'll just close those out. What I can do is I can look at this information that's here, and I have all of my action buttons across the top. So if I wanted to see how this invoice has been coded, I can do that. I can, make any changes that I need to. We talked about those tooltips. I can just go ahead and pop up the tooltip as I'm looking at my cost code or cost category or job. And then, if everything looks good here, I need to add line items, I can do so. I can also approve the invoice, I can reject it, I can put the invoice on hold. If you reject or put the invoice on hold, TimberScan is going to force you to put a reason in as to why you're putting it on hold or why you're rejecting it. That way, if anyone else needs to see the status of the invoice, they can see it. Now, what I also wanted to show is that you can set this up so that basically this can work in any format at all. So I'm sitting here on my phone, I'm still seeing the invoice, I'm seeing all the supporting documents with the invoice. And then instead of those action buttons being across the top, what I can do instead is I have the action buttons built into this gray button at the top and the green button at the bottom. So I can come in here and I could say, okay, you know what, I need to reject this, or I need to put it on hold, or I'm going to email someone right from here, or I'm going to just go add a note, and maybe I take out my stylus, I put in a note, I'm done, or I just type on my keyboard or whatever I do, and then I'm finished and I just proceed forward. So the idea and the concept is that it's approvals from anywhere. It's cloud-based. I'm an approver. I'm a project manager. I'm out in the field. Instead of me having to come into the office and get my invoices, I'm just going to call them up on any device that I happen to be working from, and I'll be able to go through and review and approve them right from there. So that's kind of the approval process. And in summary, I know I kind of sped through this because we are starting to run a little bit short on time, but basically, all of this, I can do all of the approvals through here. And basically, what I also wanted to show is, well, let's do this first. So let's say that I've gone through and I've approved my invoice. And ultimately what happened is that invoice got sent to what's called final review in TimberScan. So that final review step, as I mentioned, is really that last step for someone, probably someone in accounting, to be able to take that last look at the invoices and send them off to Sage 300 once we make sure that the coding is all done properly. So now the invoices update Sage, and then all you have to do in Sage is you need to post. Now, I wanted to just highlight, before we get to the final step and the final piece of the puzzle here, because I was talking about TimberScan Go. Now, TimberScan Go, what we've done, I said that we started building this initially as kind of an approver's app, something that an approver could use in a mobile environment in the cloud. But we're taking all of the TimberScan functionality that you've seen me demonstrate today and moving all of that to TimberScan Go. Not to abandon this. If you still want to use this, that's absolutely fine. But more and more companies want to work in a browser. They want to work in the cloud. So if I'm working from home, for example, instead of me having to connect up through Citrix or Terminal Server to my server in the office, I could just work through the cloud, and I can do all the things that we just talked about. I can acquire, I can do invoice entry, I can do final review, I can do my inquiries, I can do my reports, and I can do all of my approvals. So that entire workflow process can all be done in this format, just like it can be done over here in standard TimberScan. And that's really kind of where we're going with the application, to give everyone that option of being able to process in a browser and in that browser cloud environment, as opposed to having to process on their desktop through here. Okay, let's now kind of finish the loop here. Let's complete this purchase to pay process. So I've now updated Sage 300 and I've sent my invoices over there. They've been posted, and now we're ready to go through and we're going to do we'll call it a check selection. So I select my invoices to pay in Sage. I go through my print checks option over here in Sage. And what's going to happen? So everything's going to kind of stay the same. We did our check selection. We come into print checks. The only difference is that instead of sending those actual checks out to a physical printer, we're going to, through the printer setup, there's an option here called Print to Avid. What that does is that says, okay, instead of sending these checks out to our printer and cutting physical checks, we're going to send them to TimberScan and then ultimately onto the Avid Pay network, where they can be electronically paid through Avid. Now, one of the key components and one of the most important aspects of this is never losing control. Think about a scenario where someone prints out the checks and then they have to take those checks, they have to attach them to the invoices so that someone can go through and review and sign off or approve those particular checks before they get mailed. Think about the laborious process that is. TimberScan can eliminate all of that for you. So I said print to Avid here. Now I come back into TimberScan and I'm going to go into my pay control system. Now I'm going to go in. I don't have any that need to be approved right now because we sent some over and I've already released them, but I do have some that I put on hold. Now, why would I put some, a payment that has already been basically selected from Sage 300? Why would I put it on hold? Well, maybe we're waiting for, the return of a lien waiver, or maybe we're waiting for, a compliance issue to get resolved. So I put it on hold. I can use my notification system to notify, that a reminder that, these payments have been on hold and here's why. And now I come in here. We're going to open this up. And I'm going to search, let's say, and I'll take this third transaction right here. Okay. So what it does, when I sent those payments from Sage 300 over to TimberScan, it still created what is in essence a Sage check using the Sage check numbering system, just like it normally would if I printed this check out to a printer. I have the check here at the bottom. I have the stub information at the top. In between, I have the invoices that the check is paying. But what's also just fantastic about this is that it has already attached the invoices to that check. So talk about lack or loss of control. You don't lose anything here. I'm still looking at this payment, this check. I have the invoice or invoices that the check is paying with all of the supporting documents all the way down to that approval page. So I can simply come in here, I can look at this and say, oh, okay, this looks good. Now I'm ready to go ahead and approve and release it. Now, of course, I'm pulling this up from the hold screen. If I were in the approval screen, I could actually put them on hold from there. Voiding does not actually physically void it back in Sage. It sends a message to the person who is responsible for executing that check run to let them know that we're not going to go ahead and let this check go out. We need to void it. So you need to go back into Sage and void it there. But once I approve it, it gets released to the Avid Pay network, and then Avid Exchange basically absolves you from any liability with respect to check fraud. You don't have to go through and manage all of your ACH with all of your various vendors. That's all done by Avid. There are 3 different ways in which the vendor can choose to be paid. It's all negotiated through Avid Exchange, who works with hundreds of thousands of vendors. And then, they're adding more vendors to their portfolio every day. But they can either be paid by what's called a virtual card, what's called Avid Pay Direct, which is basically direct deposit, or they can be paid by check. There may be some vendors that said, no, we still want to get a check. So Avid goes ahead and pays the vendor on behalf of you. And then what they also do is all of that information that's associated with those payments getting released to the Avid Pay network is available here for you to be able to review and search and find whatever information you need associated with any transaction. So if I come over here, got some better examples here. Here's the different payment methods. Here's this $96,000 payment made by a check to this particular vendor, on this particular, bank account, using this is the Sage check number. And here's my status. Already been issued to the supplier. Check's already been cleared. Debit requested. So it shows you the status of every single transaction. What you can also do is you can call up, if I want to, something known as the proof of payment document. The proof of payment document basically kind of replaces the check, and it can be attached to the invoice automatically. So what the system will allow you to do, when it creates a packet that you can see, for example, inside Sage, and you want to be able to see the invoice, any of the supporting documents, and the check all together, the system will allow you to be able to take this proof of payment document, and that becomes the document that gets attached to the invoice for review inside Sage or inside TimberScan. Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm going to back out of here. Let me just quickly show you that packet if we can here. Let's go to my inquiry. Oops. Go to my invoice register. Now we're just going to open it up for questions here. Yeah, here's an example where if we go back to our friendly vendor here, Power Equipment Rental. We scroll down to invoice 24011, and I click on the paperclip. All of these documents got automatically attached when the invoice was sent from TimberScan over to Sage 300. So here's my invoice. Here's that approval page. Here's the purchase order that got attached. And then here's the payment that was attached to it as well. So everything gets bundled automatically and attached, and it's available in Sage as well as in TimberScan. Okay.